The ballroom fell silent as Victoria slipped the diamond ring off her finger and placed it into Ethan's hand. Cameras flashed from every corner of the room, catching the exact moment her voice rose above the string quartet. "I deserve someone who belongs in my world," she said. And the city's elite responded with polite, cruel applause. Ethan never argued. He closed his fingers gently around the ring, thanked her for her honesty, and turned toward the door with a faint, unreadable smile. 48 hours later, the doors of a boardroom on the 52nd floor swung open, and every executive inside rose to their feet at once. Richard Cole announced the arrival of the company's majority owner, and Victoria smiled with the confidence of a woman who believed she had already won. Then Ethan walked in, took the chairman's seat as though he had never left it, and said, "Let's begin. I believe we have much to discuss." The engagement party had been staged with the kind of extravagance only old money and new ambition could produce together. Chandeliers dripping gold light over marble floors, champagne towers reflecting 100 camera flashes, and a guest list that read like a registry of New York's most photographed families. Reporters from the financial press mingled with society columnists near the entrance, drawn less by love than by Victoria Hayes herself, the youngest woman ever to run a company of that size. She stood at the center of the room in white and silver, radiant, aware of every eye, and when she lifted her hand and removed the ring, she did it slowly enough for every lens to catch the gesture. Her voice did not shake. "Ethan is a good man," she told the crowd, "but good is not always enough." She said she needed a partner who could stand beside her in boardrooms and galas alike, someone whose name opened doors rather than merely walk through them politely behind her. Laughter rippled through pockets of the crowd, soft and knowing, the kind reserved for people the room had already decided did not matter. Somewhere near the bar, an old friend of Victoria's raised a glass and murmured that she had finally come to her senses. Nobody in that gilded room seemed to notice that Ethan's expression never changed. He simply nodded, as though she had told him the weather might turn. "If that is your choice," he said quietly, "I respect it." There was no bitterness in his voice, no plea, no attempt to explain himself or defend the years they had spent together. He set down the champagne glass he had barely touched, buttoned his jacket, and walked toward the exit, while photographers trailed him for a few useless steps before losing interest and turning their lenses back toward Victoria. Outside, the autumn rain had begun to fall in a thin, steady mist over the avenue, blurring the neon signs into soft halos of color. Ethan did not call for a car. He simply walked, hands in his coat pockets, past doormen who nodded at him without recognition, past a jazz club letting out its last set of the night, past the reflection of his own face in darkened storefront windows. He looked, to anyone passing, like an ordinary man who had just lost something ordinary. No one on that sidewalk could have imagined what waited for him at the corner, idling quietly beneath a street lamp, its engine a low and patient hum beneath the sound of the rain. Behind him, inside the ballroom, the story of the evening was already being reshaped into something sharper and more entertaining than the truth deserved. Guests repeated Victoria's words to one another with small embellishments, each retelling making Ethan sound a little more pitiful, a little more deserving of what had just happened to him. A columnist near the bar was already composing the opening line of a piece in her head, something about ambition outgrowing sentiment, about a woman brave enough to choose her own future over comfortable mediocrity. None of them noticed that the man they were so quick to dismiss had not once raised his voice, had not once begged, had simply accepted the moment with a dignity none of them would have managed in his place. A Rolls-Royce pulled forward the moment he reached the intersection, its rear door opening before he had even raised a hand. The driver said nothing, only inclined his head in the manner of a man greeting someone he had served for years, and Ethan slid into the back seat as though the vehicle had been waiting there for exactly this moment, on this exact night. All along, the car moved through wet streets toward a residential tower that overlooked the park, its top floors wrapped in glass and steel in silence. When the elevator doors opened directly into the penthouse, a quiet man in a dark suit was already standing near the entrance, waiting. He inclined his head and greeted Ethan not as a friend greets a friend, but as a member of a household greets its master returning home. "Good evening, Mr. Carter," the man said, taking his coat without being asked, and Ethan walked past him into rooms that held more history than anyone at the party that night could have guessed. The apartment was vast, but sparsely furnished, filled with clean lines and quiet luxury rather than ornamentation. The kind of space that belonged to a man who had long ago stopped needing to prove anything to anyone. Rain traced slow paths down floor to ceiling windows overlooking the park. And for a long moment, Ethan simply stood there, watching the city blur into gold and gray. The phone in his pocket buzzed once, twice, and he finally answered it without checking who was calling, because he already knew. The voice on the other end belonged to his attorney, calm and precise, a man who had worked beside Ethan through years most people would never hear about. "The board meeting will take place in 2 days," the attorney said. And there was no question in his tone, only confirmation of something long planned. Ethan closed his eyes briefly, listening to the rain against the glass, and something in his posture shifted, as though a weight he had carried gently for years was finally being set down in the right place. Those who had known Ethan casually over the past several years believed they understood him completely, a quiet widower who kept to himself, attended few events, and seemed content with an unremarkable life, far from ambition or spotlight. Colleagues at various companies where he had briefly consulted described him as thoughtful but unremarkable, competent but never hungry for more, the kind of man easily overlooked in a room full of louder personalities. That perception had been carefully built, brick by brick, over years of deliberate restraint, and almost no one alive still remembered the truth of who he had been before the silence began. Long before Victoria Hayes had ever stepped into a boardroom, Ethan Carter had co-founded the very company she now ran, back when it was little more than an idea sketched across a handful of notebooks and a modest line of credit. He had built its early infrastructure with 2 partners who later left for other ventures, poured years of his life into its survival during a recession that nearly buried it, and personally guaranteed loans that would have ruined most men had the gamble failed. When his wife died suddenly, years into the company's success, something in him simply stopped wanting the recognition that came with power, and he began, quietly and deliberately, to disappear from public view. He handed daily operations to a rotating series of trusted executives, stepped back from every stage and every headline, and let the company grow under names other than his own. What almost no one understood, not even the board members who had worked there for over a decade, was that Ethan had never actually sold his shares. He had simply moved them into structures designed to remain invisible. Holding companies wrapped inside, holding companies, until the majority ownership of one of the city's most talked-about corporations rested quietly, almost anonymously, in his hands. His attorney, a sharp and careful woman named Grace Whitfield, was one of only a handful of people who understood the full architecture of what Ethan had built and protected in silence. She had once asked him, years earlier, why he insisted on remaining invisible when so many men in his position would have used their wealth to command attention at every opportunity. Ethan had answered simply that he had watched too many people mistake noise for substance, and he had no interest in building a life around an image, rather than the truth of who he actually was. She had managed his affairs since the year his wife passed, watching him retreat further and further from the world, while the value of what he owned only continued to grow. On the phone that rainy night, she did not ask him how he felt about what had happened at the engagement party, because she already understood that Ethan Carter had never needed anyone's pity, least of all his own. Instead, she asked him a single question, direct and quiet. "Are you ready to come back?" There was a long pause on the line, filled only by the soft percussion of rain against glass, before Ethan finally answered, his voice steady and certain in a way it had not been in years. "It's time," he said, and somewhere in that simple sentence was the sound of a door slowly reopening after being closed for a very long time. Across the city, in a penthouse suite rented for the evening by Richard Cole himself, Victoria Hayes was celebrating what she believed to be the beginning of a new and better chapter. Champagne flowed freely among a small circle of the city's most influential names, all of them assuring her that she had made the right decision. That ambition required sacrifice, that sentiment had no place in the life of a woman destined for greatness. Richard stood near the window with a glass in hand, watching her laugh among her admirers. Already calculating how much closer this moment brought him to controlling influence he had wanted for years, he leaned toward her at one point during the evening, his voice low and warm with false reassurance. "This is only the beginning," he told her, promising boardroom expansions, new partnerships, an aggressive push into international markets that would make her name known far beyond the borders of the city. Victoria believed him completely, because believing him was easier than questioning why a man 20 years her senior had suddenly become so invested in her personal happiness. She raised her glass that night to a future she thought she had finally secured for herself, unaware that the very foundation beneath her feet had already begun to shift. The first sign of trouble arrived quietly, buried inside a quarterly report that crossed her desk less than 2 weeks later, showing revenue numbers that made no logical sense against the previous year's momentum. Contracts that had seemed secure only months earlier were suddenly under review, clients citing vague concerns about long-term stability, investment funds requesting meetings that felt more like interrogations than routine check-ins. Victoria assured her team it was nothing, seasonal fluctuation, market noise, the kind of temporary dip every growing company experienced from time to time. Victoria called a meeting of her senior team, demanding explanations that no one seemed able to provide with any real confidence. Marketing blamed a shifting economy. Sales blamed hesitant clients. And finance offered projections that grew vaguer with every passing week, none of them willing to say plainly that something structural had changed beneath the company's foundation. She began sleeping less, reviewing reports late into the night, convinced that if she simply worked harder, the numbers would eventually return to where they belonged. But the pattern continued and worsened, until finally, one of the largest investment partners requested something unusual. Something Victoria had never once been asked for in all her years running the company. They wanted a direct meeting with the majority owner. A figure Victoria had always assumed was more legend than reality. A name whispered occasionally in old paperwork but never once seen, never once present at a single meeting in her tenure as chief executive. She had, in fact, always believed the term itself was symbolic. A formality left over from the company's earliest structuring documents. Nothing more. Sophia Grant, her loyal executive assistant, was the one who finally brought the truth to her attention, sliding a folder across the desk with an expression Victoria had rarely seen on her before, something close to fear. Inside were transfer records dating back years, quietly filed, legally airtight, showing a controlling stake that had never actually left the hands of its original founder. Victoria read the documents twice, certain there had been some clerical mistake, before Sophia spoke the words that would unravel everything she believed about the last several years of her life. "They're saying the owner is coming," Sophia said softly. "In person. To the next board meeting." The morning of the meeting arrived gray and cold, the kind of autumn day where the sky seemed to press low over the glass towers of the financial district like a held breath. Victoria arrived early, dressed with more precision than usual, rehearsing explanations for numbers that had continued to slide despite every effort her team had made to stabilize them. She told herself repeatedly that, whoever this owner was, he would be reasonable, understanding, perhaps even grateful for her leadership through difficult circumstances he could not possibly fully understand. Inside the boardroom, tension gathered like static electricity long before the appointed hour, executives whispering among themselves, assistants adjusting chairs that had already been adjusted twice. Richard Cole moved through the room with unusual energy, greeting people with a warmth Victoria had rarely seen from him, as though he alone knew something the rest of them did not. Daniel Brooks, the chief financial officer and Richard's closest ally, kept glancing at his phone, his jaw tight, his usual composure fraying at the edges in a way that made Victoria's stomach tighten with unease. At exactly the appointed time, the doors at the far end of the room opened, and without hesitation, every single executive in the room rose to their feet at once, a wave of movement that swept through the room like an unspoken command. Victoria remained seated for a moment longer than the others, confused by the sheer uniformity of the gesture, before slowly rising herself, unsure exactly who or what commanded such immediate, unquestioning respect. Richard turned toward her with a small, knowing smile that made her skin prickle with something close to dread. "I think you'll enjoy meeting him," Richard said, his voice carrying just enough volume for those nearby to hear. And there was something almost cruel hidden beneath his polite tone. Victoria opened her mouth to ask who exactly they were waiting for. But before she could speak, the doors opened fully, and a figure stepped through them with the calm, unhurried confidence of a man entering a room he had built with his own hands many years earlier. For a long moment, Victoria's mind refused to process what her eyes were telling her, because the man walking toward the head of the table was Ethan. He wore a dark, impeccably tailored suit, nothing like the understated clothing she remembered from their years together, and yet his face was exactly the same, calm, composed, utterly unreadable. Richard bowed his head slightly as Ethan passed him, greeting him with words that landed on Victoria like physical blows. "Welcome back, Mr. Carter," Richard said, and the entire room echoed the sentiment in murmurs of respect that Victoria had never once heard directed at herself in all her years as chief executive. Ethan walked past her without a single flicker of surprise or hesitation, as though her presence in that room was simply an expected detail rather than the center of everything unfolding. He reached the head of the table, pulled out the chairman's seat, and settled into it with the ease of a man returning to a home he had never truly left. Victoria felt the floor tilt beneath her, the polished wood suddenly unstable, the air in the room suddenly too thin to breathe properly. "Impossible," she whispered, so quietly that only Sophia, standing near the wall behind her, seemed to hear it at all. Every assumption she had built her identity around for the past several years, her sense of control, her belief in her own singular importance to the company's success, cracked in that single instant, and she had no idea yet how much further the fracture would spread before the meeting ended. Grace Whitfield rose from her seat beside Ethan and opened a leather folder with the precise, unhurried movements of someone who had prepared this moment for a very long time. She explained, in language that left no room for argument or misinterpretation, that Ethan Carter held 61% ownership of the company through a structure of holding entities established more than a decade earlier. He was not merely an early investor, she continued, but the company's true founder, the man whose personal capital had built its first offices, whose signature had guaranteed the loans that kept it alive during its most vulnerable years. More than that, Grace revealed, Ethan had personally intervened during a financial crisis several years prior that almost no one in the current leadership even remembered, quietly injecting capital that saved the company from collapse without ever attaching his name to the rescue. He had done it, she explained, not for recognition or gratitude, but because he believed in what the company could still become, even when its numbers suggested otherwise. The room listened in stunned silence, the weight of the revelation settling over each executive differently, some with admiration, others with visible discomfort. Victoria sat frozen through the entire explanation, memory after memory rising unbidden to the surface of her mind, moments she had barely registered at the time but now understood with painful new clarity. She remembered nights early in their relationship when Ethan would quietly disappear for hours, offering vague explanations she never bothered to question because she had never considered him important enough to interrogate. She remembered the countless times colleagues at industry events dismissed him without introduction, and how he had simply smiled, never once correcting their assumptions, never once revealing the truth that could have silenced every one of them instantly. He had never boasted, never once used his position to elevate himself in her eyes or anyone else's, even when it would have been easy, even when a single sentence could have changed the entire trajectory of how the world perceived him. Sitting there now, watching him command the room without raising his voice even slightly, Victoria began to understand, slowly and painfully, exactly what she had thrown away in that ballroom 2 nights earlier. The shame settled into her chest like a stone, heavy and undeniable, impossible to ignore any longer. Ethan finally spoke, his voice carrying the same calm authority it always had. Though now that calm felt entirely different in light of everything the room had just learned. "Effective immediately," he said, looking around the table at faces both familiar and new. I will be taking direct control of daily operations." There was no dramatic flourish in his announcement, no triumphant tone, only the simple, undeniable fact of a decision already made, already final, already beyond negotiation from anyone seated at that table. He addressed the room a moment longer, explaining that the changes ahead would not be about punishment for its own sake, but about restoring a standard of honesty the company had drifted away from over the years. Several executives shifted uncomfortably in their seats, aware that his words were not directed at any single person, but landed heavily nonetheless on those who had grown too comfortable operating without real oversight. Victoria noticed, even through her own shock, that no one in the room dared interrupt him, not because they feared him, but because something in his tone commanded a kind of respect she realized she had never quite managed to earn herself, not even after years in the chief executive's chair. In the days that followed, whispered stories about Ethan and Victoria's past relationship began circulating quietly through the upper floors of the company, pieced together by employees eager to understand the strange new dynamic now governing their workplace. Those who had known them years earlier recalled that Victoria had once loved Ethan deeply, back before either of them held any real power, back when they were simply two ambitious young professionals, building careers alongside each other, in a much smaller version of this same company. Their relationship, people remembered, had once seemed inevitable. The kind of partnership everyone assumed would eventually lead to marriage. But as Victoria's star rose faster than Ethan's, as she climbed toward executive positions while he remained deliberately behind the scenes, pressure had begun to build around her from every direction. Her family, proud and status-conscious, questioned aloud why she remained with a man who seemed content with so little ambition, comparing him unfavorably to the sons of business partners and old money families circling their social gatherings. Friends made comments disguised as concern, wondering why someone as accomplished as Victoria would tie herself to a man who appeared, at least on the surface, to be going nowhere. Slowly, and then all at once, Victoria began to internalize those voices, allowing them to reshape her understanding of what she deserved. What kind of partner would properly complement the image she was building for herself? Ethan had watched this transformation happen in real time. Quietly, without confrontation, understanding long before she did that, her heart had already begun drifting toward the life her family and friends kept describing to her. He never once tried to compete with the version of success she seemed to want. And when the moment finally came for her to choose, he had simply let her choose, without protest, without bitterness. There had been one evening, years earlier, when Victoria almost changed course entirely. Standing on the balcony of Ethan's old apartment, while he cooked dinner inside, listening to her mother's voice on the phone list, she had told her mother that night, quietly and with more conviction than she felt, that she loved Ethan regardless of what he did. Yet even then, some small part of her had already begun keeping score, comparing his quiet contentment to the louder ambitions of men she met through her growing career. And that quiet comparison had never fully gone away. In the present, desperate to understand him, desperate perhaps to salvage something from the wreckage of her own choices, Victoria requested a private meeting with Ethan through Sophia, hoping he might grant her a few minutes to explain herself, to apologize, to somehow bridge the impossible distance that had opened between them. The response came back within the hour, brief and unmistakably final. Ethan declined the meeting entirely, citing scheduling conflicts that both of them understood to be a polite fiction covering something far more absolute. That same afternoon, without any further discussion, Ethan signed a series of executive orders, restructuring the entire leadership team from the ground up, effective by the end of the month. Victoria received the documents along with everyone else, learning the full scope of the changes only when they appeared in her inbox, alongside a company-wide announcement. No personal warning extended to her despite everything they had once shared. It was, in its own quiet way, the clearest message Ethan could have sent, that whatever remained between them now existed strictly within the boundaries of business. Ethan's return to active leadership unfolded with a precision that surprised even those who thought they understood him from years of casual acquaintance. He moved through the company's operations with methodical patience, reviewing years of financial records personally, uncovering inconsistencies that had gone unquestioned, for far too long under leadership, more interested in appearances than accountability. Within weeks, several long-standing vendor contracts were quietly terminated after Ethan discovered evidence of inflated invoices benefiting a small circle of insiders who had grown comfortable, assuming no one was paying close enough attention. Daniel Brooks was among the first casualties of this new scrutiny, his role as chief financial officer terminated after Ethan's team uncovered a pattern of questionable transfers routed through shell accounts with only the thinnest layer of legitimate cover. Daniel protested loudly at first, insisting the irregularities were simple accounting errors. Standard practice, nothing worth the dramatic response Ethan seemed determined to pursue. But the evidence, once assembled, left little room for interpretation, and Daniel was escorted from the building within the same week his termination was announced. His access revoked before he had even finished clearing his desk. Richard Cole proved more difficult to remove, protected by years of relationships and favors carefully cultivated across the board. But Ethan initiated a formal investigation into his conduct that quietly gathered momentum behind closed doors. Grace led the effort personally, interviewing former employees who had left the company under circumstances that had never been fully explained, cross-referencing years of expense reports against contracts that seemed to benefit no one except Richard himself and a small circle of associates connected to him through old business relationships. Employees who had once feared speaking against Richard began coming forward once they understood that Ethan's leadership rewarded honesty rather than punishing it, describing years of intimidation, favoritism, and decisions made purely to consolidate Richard's personal influence over company operations. The investigation grew heavier with each passing week, though its full weight had not yet come crashing down. Ethan also began meeting personally with department heads across the company, something no chief executive had done in years, asking questions that went far beyond quarterly targets and touched instead on working conditions, morale, and the everyday obstacles employees faced but rarely voiced aloud to leadership. He walked the floors unannounced on occasion, listening more than he spoke, and slowly, a sense of accountability began replacing the culture of quiet fear that had settled over the company during the years he had stayed away. Sophia Grant, who had once served only Victoria, found herself increasingly drawn into these conversations as well, impressed by a leadership style built on patience rather than intimidation. Throughout this period of upheaval, something notable began happening among the broader employee base. A shift in attitude that surprised even long-tenured staff members who had grown cynical about leadership over the years. People who had once dismissed Ethan as forgettable, unremarkable, easily overlooked, began speaking about him with genuine respect, describing a leader who listened carefully before making decisions, who took responsibility publicly when mistakes occurred, rather than deflecting blame downward. He remembered names, asked thoughtful questions in meetings, and treated junior staff with the same attentiveness he extended to senior executives, a quality almost none of them had ever witnessed from leadership before. Victoria observed all of this from a diminished position within the same company she had once run without question, watching Ethan lead with a version of quiet authority she had spent years failing to recognize in him. It occurred to her, gradually and then with sudden clarity, one evening while reviewing a memo he had circulated about employee well-being initiatives, that Ethan had always been exactly the kind of leader she claimed to be searching for throughout their relationship. She had simply been too distracted by louder, flashier definitions of success to see it standing quietly beside her the entire time. The realization was not comforting. It arrived instead as a slow, aching kind of grief, the understanding that what she had once dismissed as insufficient ambition had actually been depth, patience, and character, qualities that could not be measured by a title or a headline, but mattered more than either ever could. She began watching him differently in meetings, noticing details she had somehow missed for years, the careful way he weighed every decision, the absence of ego in even his most decisive moments. Richard Cole, sensing the walls closing in around him as the investigation into his conduct deepened, decided he would not go quietly and began assembling what he believed would be a decisive counterattack against Ethan's growing authority. He fabricated documents suggesting Ethan had engaged in questionable financial dealings years earlier, timing their release carefully to coincide with a scheduled shareholder meeting where he hoped to sway enough votes to unseat him entirely. Alongside the falsified paperwork, Richard began quietly reaching out to nervous shareholders, planting seeds of doubt about Ethan's true intentions, suggesting he might be positioning the company for a hostile sale that would benefit only himself. The emergency meeting Richard called arrived with theatrical urgency. Shareholders filing into the boardroom amid rumors that had spread rapidly through carefully placed whispers over the preceding days. Richard stood before the assembled group with practiced confidence, presenting his fabricated evidence with the smooth delivery of a man who had spent decades convincing people of things that were not entirely true. For a moment, uncertainty rippled through the room, several shareholders exchanging worried glances as Richard's narrative began to take hold. But Ethan had anticipated this moment long before Richard ever set it in motion, having quietly gathered his own evidence over the preceding weeks through channels Richard never suspected were being watched. When Ethan finally stood to respond, he did not raise his voice or match Richard's theatrical energy, but simply nodded to Grace Whitfield, who began presenting a very different set of documents entirely. Video recordings surfaced showing Richard discussing the fabrication of financial records with associates months earlier, timestamps aligning perfectly with the very allegations he had just presented as fact. Email correspondence followed, unearthed through a forensic review Ethan had authorized weeks prior, revealing a hidden account Richard had used for years to funnel unauthorized payments to himself, disguised as consulting fees. The room fell into stunned silence as the evidence mounted, each new document dismantling Richard's carefully constructed narrative piece by piece, until nothing remained of his credibility at all. By the time the presentation concluded, several shareholders who had arrived prepared to support Richard's challenge were instead calling for his immediate removal from the board entirely. Richard's face drained of color as the vote proceeded, his confident posture collapsing into something smaller and more desperate, as security was quietly summoned to escort him from the building. He attempted, briefly, to argue, to threaten legal action, to remind the room of favors owed and relationships built over decades, but none of it mattered any longer against the weight of what had just been revealed. Within the hour, Richard Cole was formally removed from every position he had held within the company. His decades of influence dissolved in a single, decisive meeting. Security later confirmed that Richard had also attempted, in the days before the meeting, to quietly transfer several company assets into accounts overseas, a final act of desperation that only strengthened the case being prepared against him in the weeks that followed. He left the building that afternoon through a side entrance, avoiding the small crowd of employees gathered near the lobby, none of whom bothered to hide their relief at watching him go. Victoria watched the entire confrontation unfold from her seat near the far end of the table, her emotions building throughout the presentation until she could no longer contain them by the meeting's end. Somewhere between the revelation of Richard's betrayal and the final vote for his removal, tears began sliding silently down her face, not entirely for Richard, and not entirely for the company either. They were tears for everything she had misunderstood, for the years she had spent chasing a version of strength that turned out to be hollow, standing right beside a man whose true strength she had never once bothered to see clearly until it was too late to matter. Several weeks passed before Victoria finally gathered the courage to seek Ethan out privately, waiting one evening outside his office long after most of the staff had gone home for the night. When he emerged, she asked, quietly and without pretense, if they might speak for just a few minutes. And something in her voice, stripped of its usual polish, made him pause instead of walking past her, as he might have weeks earlier. He gestured toward a nearby seating area, and for the first time since the engagement party, they sat across from each other without an audience. Victoria did not attempt to justify what she had done, understanding finally that no explanation could undo the public cruelty of that night. Instead, she simply told him the truth, plainly and without embellishment. Admitting that she had allowed the exchange, Lambley told him to convince her that ambition and love could not coexist within the same choice. "I never stopped loving you," she said softly, her voice breaking slightly on the final word, "even when I convinced myself I had." Ethan listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable but not unkind. The same quiet patience he had shown, throughout every difficult moment of the preceding weeks. When she finished speaking, he reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew the very ring she had returned to him weeks earlier in front of the entire city's elite. Victoria's breath caught, hope flickering briefly across her face, certain for one fragile moment that he intended to offer it back to her. Instead, Ethan set the ring gently on the table between them, sliding it toward her without ceremony or explanation attached. "It belongs to the past," he said quietly, his voice carrying no anger, only a tired, honest kind of clarity that felt somehow heavier than any accusation could have been. He explained, gently but firmly, that what had broken between them was never about wealth or position or the ring itself, but about trust, about the fact that she had chosen an image of him over the truth of who he actually was, without ever giving him the chance to prove otherwise. Victoria stared at the ring sitting between them on the polished table, understanding for the first time the full weight of what she had lost, and how little of it could be measured in the terms she had once valued most. She said nothing for a long moment, because there was truly nothing left to say that could adequately address the distance her own choices had created. The silence between them stretched on, heavy but not unkind, two people acknowledging a truth neither of them could change through words alone. She left the office that night without the ring, walking home through streets she had once crossed only by car, feeling for the first time in years the full weight of consequences she could not simply negotiate her way around. Over the following weeks, she thought often about the version of herself who had stood in that ballroom, certain and cold, mistaking cruelty for confidence and status for security. It was not an easy realization to sit with, but she found, slowly, that facing it honestly felt better than the hollow comfort of pretending it had never happened at all. Several months passed before the company's transformation reached its full stride. The culture Ethan had begun rebuilding, taking firm root across every department and level of leadership. Victoria, in a decision that surprised many who had watched her rise so quickly years earlier, formally stepped down from her position as chief executive, choosing instead to remain with the company in an advisory capacity built around mentorship rather than command. She told colleagues she needed to rebuild herself from something more honest than the ambition that had once defined her. And few who witnessed her transformation over the following months doubted her sincerity. Gone were the entitlements and easy assumptions that had once accompanied her position, replaced instead by a willingness to sit in meetings as a listener rather than a director, to learn from people she once might have overlooked. She spent long hours working alongside junior staff, offering guidance without demanding credit, slowly earning back a version of respect built on substance rather than title. It was, in many ways, the hardest work she had ever done, harder than any merger or negotiation she had overseen during her years running the company. Ethan, meanwhile, continued reshaping the organization according to values he had held quietly for years but never before had the platform to fully implement. He created pathways for advancement based on demonstrated skill and character, rather than connections or charisma, promoting employees from unexpected corners of the company who had spent years being overlooked by leadership more interested in appearances. Under his direction, the culture shifted noticeably, morale improving, turnover declining, a renewed sense of purpose settling across departments that had grown weary and cynical under previous management. Sophia, watching all of this unfold from her own new position within the company, often remarked privately that she had never seen two people rebuild something so thoroughly without pretending the damage had never occurred. She admired Victoria's willingness to sit through uncomfortable meetings without defending her old decisions, and she admired Ethan's refusal to hold the past over anyone as leverage, even when he would have had every right to. It was, she thought, the quiet kind of strength that rarely made headlines but changed the shape of a company far more than any single dramatic announcement ever could. Victoria watched this transformation with genuine admiration, no longer clouded by the assumptions that had once shaped her understanding of what leadership required. She began, slowly and deliberately, proving herself again through the quality of her work rather than the authority of her title. Taking on projects others considered unglamorous, mentoring young employees with a patience that surprised even those who remembered her most demanding years as chief executive. One young analyst later remarked that the Victoria who taught her how to build a proper financial model bore almost no resemblance to the distant, image-conscious executive she had read about in old press coverage, and that difference alone said more about growth than any formal statement the company could have issued. Little by little, the distance between her and Ethan began to narrow, not through grand gestures, but through the accumulation of small, honest moments spent working side by side. They became colleagues first, collaborating on decisions with a professionalism neither of them had believed possible in the immediate aftermath of everything that happened between them. Conversations that once felt impossible grew easier over time. Discussions about company strategy giving way occasionally to quieter exchanges about the years they had lost, about lessons learned the hard way, about the kind of people they both hoped to become moving forward. Slowly, cautiously, something resembling friendship began to reform between them, built on a foundation far sturdier than the one that had crumbled at that engagement party months earlier. Nearly 2 years after the night Victoria had returned his ring in front of the entire city, Ethan invited her to dinner. A quiet, unremarkable evening compared to the extravagance that had once defined their relationship. The restaurant he chose was small, tucked away from the crowds and cameras that had once surrounded every moment of their public lives together, a place where conversation could unfold without an audience watching for weakness. Victoria arrived uncertain what to expect, having long since let go of assumptions about where their relationship might eventually lead. Over the course of the evening, they spoke honestly about everything that had happened, the mistakes, the growth, the painful clarity that had come only after everything else had fallen apart. Near the end of the meal, Ethan reached into his jacket pocket once more. And this time, he did not merely set the ring on the table between them. He held it steady in his open palm, looking at her directly, his voice calm but unmistakably sincere, in a way it had rarely been throughout their entire history together. This time, he said quietly, "If you accept it, let it be for the man I am, not for anything I happen to own." Victoria felt tears rise unexpectedly to her eyes, not from surprise this time, but from the overwhelming weight of finally understanding what real love had looked like all along. Patient, unglamorous, quietly persistent despite every reason it might have given up entirely. She reached across the table and took his hand. Instead of the ring at first, holding it for a long moment before finally, gently, allowing him to slide it back onto her finger where it belonged. In the months that followed, the company that had once nearly collapsed under the weight of hidden corruption and misplaced priorities began to thrive, in ways few had anticipated when Ethan first returned to reclaim his seat at the head of that boardroom table. Employees spoke of a workplace transformed, one where honesty was rewarded rather than punished, where leadership listened as much as it directed, where the values Ethan had quietly held for years finally found room to shape something larger than himself. Victoria, working now alongside him as both partner and equal, found in that transformation a version of purpose she had never fully understood while chasing recognition alone. The camera, in a manner of speaking, drifted finally away from the boardroom, where everything had once unraveled so publicly, away from the ballroom where a ring had been returned before an audience eager to witness a fall. The ring Victoria now wore no longer symbolized status or power, the very thing she had once believed defined a life worth living. It symbolized instead something far more difficult to earn and far more valuable to keep. Trust rebuilt slowly, after devastating loss, patience proven through years of quiet, unglamorous effort, and a partnership finally built on the truth of who two people actually were, rather than the image either of them had once tried desperately to project. The company entered a new chapter that autumn, stronger and more honest than it had ever been before, and so, in their own quiet, hard-earned way, did Ethan and Victoria. Years later, when younger employees asked how the company had transformed so completely from the culture it once tolerated, the older staff would tell a shorter version of the story, leaving out most of the drama and focusing instead on the lesson at its center. They would explain that the company had once nearly lost itself chasing image over substance, appearances over honesty, and that it had taken a single quiet man, willing to walk away without argument and return without bitterness to remind everyone what actually mattered. Victoria, when asked directly by a young executive one afternoon what she wished she had understood earlier in her career, thought for a long moment before answering honestly that the people who deserve the least attention are often the ones who deserve it the most. Ethan never spoke publicly about any of it at all. Content, as he always had been, to let the results speak on his behalf. And in the end, that quiet consistency became the very thing the company, and the woman beside him, finally learned to trust completely.